This week on Route 2020, the political conventions about to start like never before.
It's going to be one, I think, that is unprecedented.
Two candidates battling for your vote in the middle of a pandemic.
Donald Trump doesn't care.
I think there's more spirit now than there's ever been for my campaign.
Voters with questions and fears about a health crisis that just won't go away.
How many deaths is okay?
We're looking at the election day worries and hearing the presidential predictions
Donald Trump is a history breaker.
as we take you along Route 2020.
This is what democracy looks like. Our house! Our house!
Hi everyone, I'm Blair Miller. This week, the presidential campaigns should be in full swing, crisscrossing the country, leading up to the big political conventions. But as we all know, this year is anything but typical. Here on Route 2020, we bring you the most important issues from the campaign trail. Right now, that trail is taking us all down a very unusual path. And that's where we begin this week at our first stop. We won't see any of this with the conventions of 2020. First up, the Democrats with an all-virtual convention.
It's going to be a unique convention. It's going to be one, I think, that is unprecedented.
Alex Lasry is with the Milwaukee Bucks and one of the key players in getting the DNC to choose Milwaukee. But now, little, if anything, will happen there. The Democrats decided just days ago that all speakers, including candidate Joe Biden, will not be there in person. Instead, he'll address supporters from his home in Delaware. After the DNC, then the next week, Republicans will do their work.
But we won't do a big, crowded convention per se. It's just not the right time for that.
The formal nominating process will now take place in Charlotte with about 300 Republican officials. It will be much different than the big crowds that President Trump wanted. First deciding on Charlotte, then moving the big events to Jacksonville, Florida. Now it's back to Charlotte with much of the work happening behind the scenes.
So the delegates are going to North Carolina?
Right now, many schools are making plans to start the school year, and those plans really vary district by district. This school issue, though, has turned divisive with the president pushing leaders to open, and that's left teachers and parents stuck in the middle.
Every year, everybody's anxious to start school, but this is a little extra this year.
This superintendent in Indiana says it's a mix of learning that will happen at his schools, a mix of traditional in-class learning and some virtual learning. In many parts of the country, school leaders have changed strategies as coronavirus cases have gone up. Lily Eskelson Garcia is a sixth grade teacher in Utah. She wants to be in the classroom, but doesn't want to risk safety.
I know exactly what teachers are feeling right now. They're scared for their students. They're scared for themselves. They're scared for the families we all go home to.
In Seminole County, Florida, north of Orlando, teachers were sent this email asking would they want to be in the classroom or work online.
I'm fairly confident that those who need the accommodation will be given the accommodation to work remotely.
In some districts, parents are forced to decide what they think is best. The idea of micro schools has popped up in some places where parents team up with other parents to have a teacher come into a home and handle the virtual learning for a small group of kids. And then there are parents like Ashley Oria Adams in Charlotte. Her son has a specific learning plan, like an IEP. She worries about the lack of information on plans to accommodate all students remotely.
There's no communication, there are no plans, there's nothing for us parents to do.
The entire issue has turned very political, with the president threatening to deny federal funding to states that don't open schools in the fall, saying the programs that schools offer are vital. The Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, recently outlined their plan for reopening, embrace social distancing, hand washing, and face masks in schools.
Ultimately, it's not a matter of if schools should reopen, it's simply a matter of how.
For the schools that are opening in some capacity, it's left parents feeling judged either way if they decide to send their kids to school or stay put at home.
Just take it day by day. That's all we can do.
Recent polls show most Americans support some kind of change in the classroom before the fall. It's not clear, though, how this issue may impact elections, which are now less than 3 months away. Route 2020's Chris Heath looks at what's driving voters all across the country.
At this point in 2016, both political conventions were basically in the books, and the election was moving along. But this is not 2016.
Traditionally, when presidents have run for re-election, having a big, successful convention has been the thing that has launched them on that trajectory.
Patrick Ruffini is a Republican pollster with Echelon Insights. He points out not only are both conventions going almost entirely virtual this year, neither has happened yet, reducing the amount of time for things to shift. That's potentially good news for the Biden campaign, enjoying a lead nationally of about 6 points. Why? According to Patrick's research, it's not the economy, it's COVID.
People are really responding to this idea that the numbers are just going in the wrong direction.
In fact, when asked about the direction of the country, wrong track has swelled from 54% in January to 70% now, while right track has dropped 14 points. This mirrors the perceived handling of the COVID-19 outbreak by the president, with approval dropping 19 points since March and disapproval climbing to 64%.
People are pretty patient about what normal looks like, when we will return to normal, but they want to see progress, and they're not seeing it right now.
With about 3 months left in the race, anything could still happen, but bear in mind, early voting and vote by mail will get underway in about mid-October. That's 2 months away. In other words, the clock is ticking. In Orlando, I'm Christopher Heath for Route 2020.
Up next on Route 2020, we're all getting our mail now, but a lack of cash could force the Postal Service to stop working.
Everything we do, including vote by mail, will be much harder.
And it could have a serious impact on elections. Then later, being black in America and how it's viewed through the lens of 4 generations.
When you're black, you got to be twice as good to get half as far.
When Route 2020 continues. Join the conversation with us online, where you'll find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Just look for Route 2020. The U.S. Postal Service is facing a major cash crunch due to the pandemic. It recently worked out a deal with the federal government for a loan of $10 billion, but the agency says it needs $75 billion. And analysts warn that shortfall in cash could have a deep impact on Election Day. As our nation faces historic crises, another potential one looms, this time within the Postal Service. This as millions of Americans are expected to use mail-in ballots to cast their votes in November's elections.
If the funding doesn't come through, everything we do, including vote by mail, will be much harder.
Mark Diamondstein is the president of the American Postal Workers Union. He says underfunding the U.S. Postal Service could impact access to vote by mail, and election analysts told me it could be significant.
Part of what we're seeing in the way in which our elections are being delayed and people not getting ballots and other things has to do with the slowness of the mail now, which has slowed down quite a bit.
Dr. Michael McDonald, a politics professor at the University of Florida, told me he doesn't expect quick change.
It's unlikely we're going to see, because of gridlock at the federal level, any federal action that happens before now in November.
Election officials estimate the amount of absentee votes being sent in by mail could climb anywhere from 20 to 60%, meaning the Postal Service would have to deal with the increased volume.
If we can't have reliable mail service, then we're not going to have reliable democracy in the fall.
The Trump administration blocked additional funding for the Postal Service in the CARES Act, instead offering $10 billion in loans. But the president threatened to withhold any necessary funding if the USPS does not increase its prices.
If they don't raise the price, I'm not signing anything.
Over the next 2 weeks, the Democratic and Republican national conventions will look very different. Some wonder what's the point anymore, especially with both conventions mostly going virtual this year. In this week's Deep Dive, Route 2020's Samantha Manning breaks down why the conventions are still happening.
This year, the conventions are going mostly virtual. You won't see the large crowds of delegates like we usually see. The purpose of each party's convention is to get their candidate officially nominated. Sure, we already know who the nominees are. The conventions are designed to allow the parties and their nominees to officially define themselves in front of a national audience. But also important business does happen there. You'll hear a lot about delegates. Most of them won't be there this year. The delegates are the ones who attend the DNC or RNC and technically vote for a candidate to become the party's official nominee. These delegates usually know how they're voting based on their state's primary months ago. For the Republicans, 1,276 delegates are needed to secure the nomination. For the Democrats, 1,991 delegates are needed. Typically, each party spends more than $100 million to put on the week-long show, but again, not this year. If anything, this year's conventions will quickly remind everyone we're very close to an election. I'm Samantha Manning for Route 2020.
Next on Route 2020, real talk from those getting real perspective.
This is just it's such a bizarre year because the focal point is just all over the place.
How voters see the political landscape and what matters most right now. And picking a president.
Donald Trump is a history breaker.
This professor makes the predictions and hasn't been wrong in decades. Where are you now? Next on Route 2020. One man thinks he knows how to predict who will be president. He's been right ever since the early 80s. He was one of the few to predict a Trump victory 4 years ago. I sat down with the professor earlier this year before the pandemic, and recently I checked back in with him.
Donald Trump is a history breaker, makes it very difficult to make a call. Right now I've got about 5 keys down against Trump, 1 key short of predicting his defeat, but a lot of keys could still change.
Where are you now?
The election is too close to call.
That was American University professor Alan Lichtman back in February. But a lot's changed since I sat down with him. The DC professor has been predicting presidential winners for more than 30 years. The keys to the White House, he calls them. There are 13 total, and Lichtman says if 6 or more of the keys go against the party in office at the White House, then they will likely lose.
Back at the end of 2019, things were looking pretty good for Donald Trump. He was down 4 keys, take 6 keys to count him out. So he had a 2-key cushion. But as you say, we've now been hit with a triple crisis, the pandemic, the protests following the killing of George Floyd, and of course, the major blow to the economy. And this has put 3 more keys in serious jeopardy. The short-term economic key, the long-term economic key, and the social unrest key. But things are looking far worse for President Trump now than they were at the end of 2019.
After our interview, Professor Lichtman did make his prediction. He said the keys predict that Trump will lose the White House.
Have you ever had to make a prediction in this kind of environment?
No, we've never had this triple crisis descending upon the country. So my predictions had nothing to do with the polls and the pundits. In fact, in predicting Donald Trump was going to win last time, I contradicted all the pollsters and the pundits.
The past 2 months have shown just how important race is to the national conversation. For this week's Capitol Buzz, I spoke with a group of radio news hosts who say there's a lot to talk about right now and people aren't holding back. To get this started, the reason why I wanted to talk with you all is because obviously you're in different parts of the country, but to really get a sense of what's most important to people right now. And there's a lot out there in front of people. But as you hear from people and as you talk with people, what's most important right now?
Actually, for our listeners, it's freedom. If I played back for you our open mics from the show this morning, which we just finished, you would hear probably 90% saying that an assault on my rights and assault on my freedoms. COVID-19, whether we go to school, if we're going to play college football, that is all they're talking about and how they feel about being forced to do certain things.
In addition to the mask mandate or no mandate, who's going to do the right thing? Parents are concerned about, what do I do with my kids when school is supposed to start? We have this unemployment rate. I'm an essential worker or I'm an hourly worker. I can't go to work. Who's going to look after my kids?
And here in Jacksonville, Florida, if I may, that continues to be a big topic as well for parents, because you do have parents here locally that are discussing, everybody has an opinion, whether or not kids should go back to school, whether or not they should, learn remotely.
Everything everyone's talking about, what about with race? Because that issue was front and center for weeks, months. And are you hearing as much about that, or is that changing?
It's kind of true that it ebbs and flows. The pandemic kind of calmed down for a while during the troubles that we had here in Atlanta, including a riot and a police shooting. And then the pandemic has come back to the fore. It really sort of ebbs and flows. Things have moved so quickly, though, that between now and November, you just don't know. It seems as if the pandemic probably will get the most attention because the situation obviously is getting worse. But there's just really no way to tell.
I think the two issues are moving forward somewhat on a parallel path, depending upon the day and what folks are interested in. Both of those issues will be somewhat first and foremost as we move towards November.
And in radio terms, it's just like everything else. For all the humanity involved, the destruction and the property and the violence, it all gets back down into politics on the talk radio. Pro-mayor, anti-mayor, pro-law and order, pro-demonstrations. It breaks down almost as everything else along lines, and there is no way to separate any of it, it seems, from just raw politics.
There's no not political subject anymore. There's not one.
You talk about how close we are to the election. Do you think people are focused on the election right now?
I think it's very hard to focus right now because you do have mass concern from everybody on COVID-19 and what it means and mask ordinances and what should be done, what shouldn't be done. So you go from, COVID-19 concerns to marches downtown, to discussions about, Confederate statues. And in all of this, that we're coming up on an election. And it's just so, having covered multiple elections in my career, this is just so, it's such a bizarre year because the focal point is just all over the place. I mean, it's so hard to focus.
Well, and I was going to say to you all, you're paid to talk, right? So last question here. If you can sum up in one word how voters feel where you live, what would you say?
Mad.
Referendum on Trump. That's 3 words. I cheat, but I think that's the story here.
I'd say engaged because we've seen the lines for the primary in Georgia. State Farm Arena was used as a precinct in a runoff, and there's a sense in Atlanta and in state of Georgia that folks will be voting as if their lives depend on it.
And I know I'm going last here, but I'm going to use the word engaged as well. I mean, you're seeing that in multiple different arenas right now in discussion.
Well, it's certainly going to be interesting what happens over the next couple of months as we get closer to November. So thank you all for your time. It's a pleasure to work with you all and a pleasure to hear what people are saying where you all live. Thanks, guys. Next,
this should be the change. This should happen now.
The issue of race not lost on the minds of these 4 men.
All 4 of us have said hello to someone in an elevator and been ignored.
4 men, 4 generations, and 4 different views when Route 2020 continues. Some might call what we're seeing across the country a racial awakening. But for Black Americans, the stories of racism and about race aren't new. In this week's Beyond the Hill, Route 2020's Kirsten Garris sits down with 4 generations of Black men.
They all have stories of racial inequality.
When you're Black, you got to be twice as good to get half as far. Second, when you're Black, you'll be accused of things that you didn't do.
That have been passed down from generation to generation.
I need you to come home alive. I need you to survive these encounters, first of all.
I have a dream. Racism isn't limited to the fight for basic human rights of the civil rights movement or the protest for police accountability of today. Black Lives Matter! Racism is found in the quiet moments of everyday life.
All 4 of us have said hello to someone in an elevator and been ignored. All 4 of us have had someone get off the elevator before we could get on.
Inside the National Civil Rights Museum, I sat down with 4 Black men from 16 to 71, representing 4 different generations, all dealing with varying levels of racism in their own lives. Roby Williams, a born and bred Memphian, still vividly remembers the Jet magazine article about Emmett Till, the 14-year-old African-American boy lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of flirting with a white woman.
That night I had a horrible, very vicious nightmare. I said, I don't want to die like that, I don't want to die like that, I don't want to break your heart. And my brother said, he's reacting to that picture he saw of Emmett Till. What you doing showing my baby that? Well, and we got past that. But at age 6, that was traumatizing. I mean, really, really, really traumatizing.
Williams says that's the kind of impact a photo had on his life. Now the still photos from 1955 have transformed into the viral videos of 2020.
I feel like the psychological impact on seeing the video of George Floyd, like begging for his life, calling for his mom, when he's like, I can't breathe, and the officer just not caring, clearly not caring. I just feel like the psychological impact on my youth, like millions of us have to see that. Like millions of us probably watched it over and over again.
30-year-old Patrick Hillard says one of the most traumatic moments in his life came from a standardized test in 5th grade. Hillard's father is black and his mother is white.
I had a Caucasian American tell me, "You're black because you don't look like me." I had an African American, "No, you're not as dark as me, so you must be white." Someone says, "Well, there's the 1 drop rule, you're black." And in 5th grade, I look at my teacher, 1 drop rule, what does that mean? And well, actually it's something that, we tend to follow your father's ethnicity in America. What is your father? African American? Well, I think that's what you should put. So I feel in the circle, not realizing at that point I just chose that I am an African American man.
Farmer says he didn't have just one talk with his son and daughter about racism. He says it's a constant discussion in his household.
Despite our history in this country and the things that have been done to us systemically, that we still survive, absolutely, there are people that just hate you.
These 4 black men are not related, but their stories are the conversations and the subtle instances that happen every day to black Americans. While he doesn't have the answers, the youngest of the group says he has hope. Hope that one day this generational pain will become generational healing.
To have hope for the future, and I'm confident, like this go round, this should be the change. This should happen now.
So what does generational healing look like? What does it feel like? A therapist with Tennessee Voices says part of the healing process is recognizing that hurt does exist, but that healing is possible. In Memphis, Kirsten Garris for Root 2020.
Their hope for the future is one that many have been fighting for a very, very long time. Over the next couple of weeks, as the candidates accept their nominations, promises will be made, strong words will be said. 1952 was the first time that both conventions were carried live on television across the nation. And this week, a new first in the history books, the first virtual convention. And then after that, it's a race to the finish line for Election Day. I'm Blair Miller. Thanks for watching Route 2020.